Every single story you are about to hear started the same way yours did. With an ordinary day, an ordinary place, an ordinary person doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Then something happened that no one could explain. Not investigators, not doctors, not engineers, not the people who survived it. 10 stories. 10 fractures in the version of reality you have been comfortable living inside. Before this video ends, at least one of these stories will feel personal to you. Not because we chose it for you, because it already happened near you and you almost noticed. Check your doors right now. It's from True Terror Files Official. This is tonight. Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, the channel that tells you everything, exactly as it happened, exactly as it was reported. Because the people in these stories deserve to be believed, and because you deserve to know what is actually out there in the world that we have all agreed, by silent consensus, not to look at too directly. Tonight we have 10 stories, 10 completely ordinary people in completely ordinary circumstances who discovered, without warning and without any preparation, that reality has seams. And that when you find one of those seams, when you press your fingers into the gap and feel what is on the other side, you cannot unfeel it. An apartment with rooms that were never on any floor plan. Pharmacist filling prescriptions for the dead. A substitute teacher whose classroom should not have existed. A contractor who found a house inside a house. Letters written in a handwriting you recognize as your own that arrived before you wrote them. Horror does not announce itself. It does not send a warning. It waits in the walls of the building you already live in the corridor you already walk every night, in the reflection of the face you have already looked at 1,000 times without seeing what is standing just behind it. We are going to tell you all 10 stories. Nothing softened, nothing edited, nothing left out. Stay with us. This is True Terror Files Official. And tonight, we do not stop until all 10 are told. Renata Sousa was 31 years old, freelance graphic designer who had moved 7 times in 9 years. Carrying her life in a careful inventory of boxes, she had long since learned to pack efficiently and unpack with the specific optimism of a person who treated each new apartment as a version of something better finally arrived at. And when she signed the lease on apartment 3F at the Halcyon building in the Westfield district, she told herself without reservation that this was the one she was going to stay in. That the high ceilings and the genuine hardwood floors and the east-facing windows that pulled the morning light across, the main room and a wide, warm band justified the slightly below-market rent in a way that required no further investigation. And the first 3 weeks confirmed everything she had hoped. The building was quiet. Her neighbors were unremarkable in the best possible way. And she settled into the apartment with the genuine ease of a person who has found the right fit after a long search. She was reorganizing the bedroom closet in her 4th week, adjusting shelving positions to better accommodate her actual storage habits rather than those of whoever had lived there before, when she noticed that the rear wall did not feel flush. And she investigated in the practical way of someone comfortable with physical spaces. Pressing her palms along the surface, and found a vertical seam on the right side running from the baseboard to the ceiling. Precise and even, the exact line of a cut made by a person who was skilled with tools and was trying to leave as little evidence of the cut as possible. And when she pressed the panel, it swung inward on a center pivot. And without resistance, the motion of something that had been opened and closed enough times to have lost all friction. And the space behind it was not a utility access and not a mechanical corridor. It was a room, approximately 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, running parallel to the bedroom wall. With a finished plank floor and a finished ceiling, and 4 walls that had been treated on every surface with professional-grade acoustic dampening material, the rigid fibrous kind used in recording studios and intelligence installations, applied in rectangular panels with adhesive and precise, even rows that told Renata. Even before she processed the implications, whoever had built this space had been serious about it, had planned it carefully, had wanted it to function well. She stepped into the space with her phone's flashlight and let the room resolve around her in complete detail. 3 wooden shelves along the left wall, recently emptied and recently dusted, she could tell from the even and undisturbed layer of settled dust that the shelves had been cleared methodically, each item removed and the surface wiped before departure, not abandoned in haste, but departed from with care. And on the floor at the far end, a rectangular impression approximately 18 inches wide by 30 inches long, where something dense and flat had sat for long enough to compress the surface permanently. Dimensions consistent with equipment she could name if she wanted to name it, and she did not want to name it yet, and along the right wall. At a height of 4 feet 6 inches, 3 circular apertures bored through the plaster and lath at 3-foot intervals, each approximately 1 centimeter in diameter, and when she put her eye to the first aperture and looked through it, she was looking at her own bedroom from the angle of a person standing in this room and observing through the hole. Her bed, pillow, her nightstand, the specific angle of the lamp she had positioned at the corner. The book she had left face down on the mattress that morning, the glass of water she kept beside the bed every night, the phone charger, all of it visible in complete and unobstructed clarity through a hole smaller than the circumference of a marble. A hole she had been sleeping 3 feet from 4 weeks without knowing it existed. She went through the apartment then with the focused energy of someone who has decided to know everything before deciding how to feel about it, and she found the second concealed room behind the bathroom mirror, which was a medicine cabinet mounted on a pivot identical to the bedroom closet panel, concealing a narrow observation space with a single aperture positioned at the level of the shower. And she found a third space accessible through a secondary panel in the entry coat closet, positioned to cover the living room seating area and the front door. And then she sat on the kitchen floor, which appeared to have no observation corridor behind its walls, the only room that didn't, and called the building manager, a man named Gerald Ash, who arrived 40 minutes later and stood in the bedroom closet doorway and looked at what the panel revealed with an expression that Renata, who was watching him carefully, classified as poorly concealed recognition. Not the surprise of a man encountering something unexpected, but the tightened containment of a man seeing something he had hoped was no longer there. When she asked how long the rooms had been built into the apartment, Ash said he didn't know. And when she asked about the previous tenant, he said the apartment had been vacant 8 months before her lease. And when the police arrived and documented everything their documentation confirmed, the acoustic treatment was professional and purposeful. The apertures were precision bored and precisely positioned. The electrical junction points in the far observation room indicated that the equipment impression on the floor had been connected to a dedicated circuit. And the detective who sat with Renata afterward and spoke carefully in the way detectives speak when they are telling you something, significant while maintaining technical neutrality, said that the physical configuration of the 3 observation rooms was consistent with a sustained and designed surveillance installation. Not a casual modification, but a purpose-built system. And then he said the thing that Renata has not been able to stop thinking about in the 3 years since she left that apartment. The acoustic dampening on the walls of the observation spaces was not installed facing outward, toward the apartment, which would be the configuration of someone who wanted to hear what happened inside the apartment. Without being detected, it was installed facing inward, toward the person in the observation room, which was the configuration of someone who needed to ensure that the sounds they were making while they were in the room, whatever sounds those were, whatever they were doing in a space the size of a closet at 3 in the morning, 3 feet from a sleeping person on the other side of the wall, could not be heard by anyone outside it. And Renata has never lived on the ground floor of any building since, and she no longer uses closets with solid rear walls. And she has never once looked at a medicine cabinet without pressing her palm flat against its surface before she opens it. Winston Hale was 43 years old and worked as a senior systems analyst at a mid-sized logistics company in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he was the kind of technically competent professional who had over 15 years quietly accumulated the institutional knowledge of his organization in the way that reliable and unglamorous workers do, becoming the person who knew where the bodies were buried in every major project, the person whose desk the complicated questions eventually arrived at, and he was not a man given to what he would have characterized as mystical thinking. Had no patience for ambiguity when data was available, and resolved his professional and personal life against the same fundamental standard. If you could not measure it, if you could not manage it, and if you could not manage it, it was noise. Dennis Pryor had worked in the adjacent department for 11 years, and had been something closer than a colleague and something shorter of a close friend. The specific grade of relationship built from shared project pressure in office. Proximity and the shorthand that develops between people who have worked alongside each other long enough to understand, without being told, how the other processes information and when. Dennis died unexpectedly of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning at the age of 41. Winston felt the grief of that particular relationship with the full weight that such relationships carry despite their quiet nature, and he attended the funeral and returned to his desk the following week and did what one does: closed the open files, forwarded the outstanding project threads, and moved forward with the subdued institutional efficiency of an office reconstituting itself around the space that has been made by an absence. The first email arrived on a Wednesday night, 12 days after the funeral, at 11:47 p.m., and Winston saw it on his phone at 2 in the morning when he woke. It, as he habitually did, to check on the international coordination threads that ran overnight. The email was from Dennis's work address, which it had decommissioned within 72 hours of the death notification, which was standard protocol, and had been confirmed complete, and the subject line was blank. And the body of the email contained a single complete sentence in the plain, efficient style that Dennis had always used for written communication, which had always been direct to the point of terseness. Check the Halverson routing analysis Appendix Q for figures against the operational calendar independently. Nobody has done this, and it will cost the client 6 weeks when it surfaces. Winston lay in the dark with his phone and read this sentence 3 times, and then forwarded it to himself to confirm it was real, which it was. And in the morning he pulled the Halverson routing analysis, which was a report Dennis had been working on before his death, and which had been completed by a colleague and reviewed and approved, and was 3 days from client delivery. And he ran the Appendix Q for figures against the operational calendar independently, which no one had done because it was a check that required understanding the relationship between 2 non-adjacent parts of the document. And the figures were wrong. specifically wrong in a way that would create a cascading scheduling error that would not surface until mid-project. And that would cost approximately 6 weeks of remediation work. And Winston stopped the delivery and corrected the error and saved the client relationship and sat at his desk after work that evening. With the email still open on his screen and the specific quietness of a person who has run out of rational framings for what they are looking at. He contacted IT, who confirmed the account had been decommissioned on schedule and that no outbound email had been transmitted from it. And they suggested credential spoofing, and he accepted this because it was the only framework they could provide. Though credential spoofing would not explain how the spoofed email contained specific and accurate technical knowledge of a report that only Dennis and Winston and 2 other people had read. The second email arrived 17 days later at a similar hour and said, Section 14. Paragraph 3 of the Mercer Contract Renewal Auto-Escalation Clause. Legal hasn't seen it. Your window is before Thursday. Winston found the clause, and legal reviewed it before Thursday. And the company's negotiating position was materially and significantly improved as a direct result. By the 5th email, Winston had stopped trying to explain the mechanism and had started doing what the emails told him to do. Because the alternative, deciding the emails were not real, required him to explain why every single thing they had told him to do had proven to be correct. And the mechanism of their arrival, whatever it was, did not change the accuracy of their content, and accuracy was the only standard he had ever applied to information. The 6th email was different from the others. It arrived on a Sunday, not a weeknight, and it was longer. 4 sentences instead of 1, and it said, Tell Karen her diagnosis is wrong. Second opinion. I know you know what I mean. Please. Karen was the company's HR director who had been managing what she had described 2 close friends in the office as a health concern she was monitoring. And Winston knew this because Dennis had been one of those friends and had told. Winston in one of the specific confidences of their particular grade of relationship. And Winston was therefore the only person in the building who knew about Karen's health situation, who had also been receiving emails from Dennis's decommissioned email address. He sat with the convergence of these facts for 2 full days before he wrote Karen a careful and personal email that said, without explanation, that he had been thinking about her and wanted to say, gently and as a friend rather than a colleague, that if there was any uncertainty at all in her current medical situation, a second opinion was always reasonable and never an overreaction. And Karen got the second opinion, and the first diagnosis had been wrong. And the correct diagnosis was something that caught early was entirely treatable and was being treated, and Karen's prognosis is good. And Karen is alive, and the emails have continued to come, irregular in timing, specific in content, always accurate, and Winston has a folder now, a private folder on his personal laptop, not his work machine, where he keeps every one of them, organized by date. And he calls it the draft folder because it seemed like the right name for a collection of messages that feel like they were written by someone who knew they were running out of time to say everything that needed saying and was, using whatever mechanism was available to finish the work. Dr. Miriam Calloway had been a licensed child psychologist for 16 years, with a specialty in childhood anxiety and trauma-adjacent behavioral presentations. And she understood the phenomenon of persistent imaginary companions with the clinical precision and genuine intellectual respect of a professional who had spent a career watching children use creative interior resources to process, experiences, their vocabulary was not yet equipped to address directly the developmental normalcy of the phenomenon in children between 3 and 8, the specific emotional and psychological functions the companion typically served, the ways in which the companion's behavior in a child's narratives could serve as a precise index of what the child was actually processing. And when 8-year-old Tobias Fenwick was referred to her practice by his school counselor, the referral documentation described a persistent engagement with an imaginary companion that had become disruptive to classroom functioning and was causing distress to other students. And Miriam reviewed the file with calm professional attentiveness and scheduled the intake session with the settled confidence of someone who understood. The shape of the presenting concern, Tobias was a small, precise child with a formal manner and a directness of eye contact that Miriam noted in her intake observation as unusual. For a child presenting with anxiety-adjacent material, most such children looked away during disclosure, and he told her, in the first session, without prompting and without any visible distress, the companion's name was Mr. Caul. That Mr. Caul was tall and wore a dark coat. That he had been present in Tobias's life since before Tobias had memory. And that Mr. Caul possessed specific knowledge of events and places and people that Tobias himself had no direct access to. And that he communicated this knowledge to Tobias in a conversational manner, not intrusively, but matter-of-factly. The way a person who knows things will simply tell you what they know when it becomes relevant. Miriam documented this and began the standard therapeutic approach, understanding the companion's role in the child's emotional landscape rather than contesting the companion's existence. Because the clinical goal was never to dispute the child's experience, but to understand its function and assess whether the function was supportive or symptomatic. And for the first 3 sessions, this approach proceeded normally. And Tobias was a responsive and articulate subject who described Mr. Caul with a consistency and specificity that was notable in the way that very genuine, imaginative constructs tended to be consistent and specific, with none of the improvised quality of a fabricated story. It was in the 4th session that the variable appeared that Miriam's training had not specifically prepared her for, Tobias said. With the same directness, he applied to everything that Mr. Caul had asked him to tell her something. And Miriam said what she always said in such moments, that Tobias could tell her anything that felt important to him. And Tobias looked at her with the patient eye contact he had maintained throughout every session and said, "He knows about the building on Crestfield Road. He says you were there with your father on October 9th, 1987, and that your father left something inside it on purpose, and that you have been wondering your entire life why he was quiet on the drive home." Miriam sat with this statement for a period of time that she cannot now accurately estimate. It felt long, and then asked, "Dude," in the level clinical voice she had spent 16 years building. How Tobias had come to know that information. And Tobias said that Mr. Caul had told him that morning before school, and that Mr. Caul said she would know it was true. The building on Crestfield Road was a structure Miriam had not thought about in years, a decommissioned textile facility. She had visited with her father when she was 9 years old, for reasons he had never explained and which she had never asked about directly. And the date was correct, and her father had been silent on the drive home in a way she had registered as a child registers adult silences, without the vocabulary to name what it contained, but with the full-bodied reception of someone absorbing something significant without comprehending it. And the specific content of what Tobias had said was not something that could have been constructed from any observable or accessible source. Not a school record, not a social media post, not any document or conversation or inference that could have reached an 8-year-old boy through any traceable channel. Miriam terminated the session professionally, made appropriate notes, and drove home and called her father, who was 71, and living in the same house in which Miriam had grown up, and asked him about Crestfield Road, they said. And there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then her father said, "Who told you to ask that?" She said she had encountered it professionally. Which was true enough. And her father said, carefully, "I left something there so it wouldn't follow us home. I don't want to say more than that. Don't go to Crestfield Road, and don't ask the boy anything further about it." Miriam filed a clinical discontinuation for the Fenwick case on the grounds of a conflict of interest she declined to specify. And she referred to bias to a colleague, and she has not returned to Crestfield Road. And she has not asked her father to explain. And she has not sought any further information about Mr. Caul, because she is a trained psychologist who spent 16 years learning to understand the difference between what a child is processing and what a child is receiving. And she understands, without any desire to investigate further, which of those two categories the Fenwick case belongs to. Adela Vance had been a licensed pharmacist for 20 years, the last 11 of which she had spent as the sole overnight pharmacist at the Whitmore Medical Center Pharmacy, a 24-hour dispensary that served the hospital's inpatient population, and a narrow window of outpatient prescriptions from the attached clinic, and she understood the nocturnal rhythm of that work with the thorough and unglamorous familiarity of someone whose professional life had been organized around 3 a.m. in a fluorescent room with a controlled substances cabinet and a prescription queue that never entirely cleared. And she was good at the work in the way that people are good at work they chose, with full knowledge of what it required. Which is to say, she was precise, she was careful. She was untroubled by the isolation. She had developed over 11 years the specific professional fluency of a person who has processed a very large number of prescriptions and retains, without deliberate effort, a working memory of the names and medications and dosage histories of the hospital's recurring patient population. The prescription arrived on a Wednesday in early November, routed through the hospital's electronic prescribing system at 2:19 a.m., a standard system-generated order, properly formatted, physician credential verified, patient record number attached, all fields complete and compliant. And when Adela pulled the patient record to cross-reference against the medication order, she stopped, because the patient record number belonged to a woman named Helen Grace Moorfield, 83 years old, cardiac history, for whom Adela had filled multiple prescriptions over the preceding 2 years, and who had died in the hospital's cardiac care unit 14 days earlier. A fact Adela knew with specificity because she had processed the medication discontinuation order on the night of Helen Moorfield's death, had noted the time of death in the discontinuation log as 2:47 a.m. on the 22nd of October, and had filed the record in the standard closed account protocol the following morning. The medication being ordered was a specific cardiac glycoside at a dosage and formulation that matched exactly the standing prescription profile Adela had filled for Helen Moorfield. For the previous 19 months, not a general prescription for that medication, but the precise individualized protocol of that specific patient, and the prescribing physician's credential on the order was that of Dr. Raymond Shue, who was Helen Moorfield's cardiologist and who was As Adela knew from the unit communications, currently in Singapore attending a cardiology symposium and was not scheduled to return until the following week, she flagged the order as anomalous and called the hospital's overnight IT support, who investigated the prescribing system access log and reported, with visible discomfort, that the order had been entered from a terminal in the cardiac care unit at 2:17 a.m. That the terminal's user session showed Dr. Shu's credential, and that the access log showed no remote session. The credential had been used from the physical terminal on the unit floor, which was a secure area requiring keycard access. And the keycard log for that terminal's location showed no card swipe between midnight and 6 a.m. on that date, which was not technically possible because the door required a valid swipe for entry regardless of the hour. The hospital's security review, which took 3 days and involved the prescribing system vendor, the keycard system vendor, and the hospital's compliance officer, concluded in writing that the prescription order was genuine, meaning it had been entered into the system through the legitimate interface, using a legitimate credential from a legitimate physical terminal, and that no mechanism for how this had occurred was identifiable. And the compliance officer's summary notation read, "Entry origin, confirmed terminal 4C East. User credential, Dr. R. Shu, patient record, H.G. Moorfield deceased. No physical access recorded to terminal location during entry window. No remote session active. No system intrusion detected." Cause of anomalous entry, undetermined. Adela returned to work the following Wednesday, and she processed 211 prescriptions on that shift without incident. And at 2:19 a.m., she noticed the time because she had not been able to stop noticing the time since the previous Wednesday. Her prescription queue showed a new order, and she stood at the counter for a moment before looking at it. And when she looked, it was a routine antibiotic for a patient in the orthopedic ward whose name she did not recognize, and nothing was wrong. And she processed it and continued her shift, and she has continued her shifts every week since. And the anomalous order has not recurred. And the prescription for Helen Grace Moorfield remains in the flagged file in the compliance department, properly documented and entirely unexplained. And what Adela has not included in any formal report because there was no field in the incident documentation that invited. This particular observation is that the dosage on the prescription was different from Helen Moorfield's standing protocol in one specific way. It was the dosage that Helen Moorfield's cardiologist had told her in their final appointment 3 weeks before her death that he would consider switching her to in the spring. A conversation that had taken place in a private clinical consultation that was documented in the patient chart, but that no one outside that room and that chart had any reason to know about. And Helen Moorfield had died before the spring. And someone or something operating through channels that the hospital's combined security and compliance apparatus could not identify or name, had submitted the prescription she never got to fill. Phillip Stride had been a substitute teacher for 7 years, which is a career that produces, in its long-term practitioners, a specific and finely calibrated adaptability, the ability to enter any classroom, read the room within 4 minutes, establish workable authority over a group of children who neither know you nor owe you any particular compliance, and deliver a functional day of instruction in a subject you may have been notified about only that morning. And Phillip was good at it in the practiced and unsentimental way of someone who had long since stopped finding the novelty of each new assignment interesting, and had replaced novelty with competence, which is always the superior exchange. He received the call at 6:48 a.m. on a Thursday. The standard automated system call offering him a day placement at Dunmore Elementary School covering a 5th grade class whose permanent teacher had called in sick, and he accepted, drove to the school, signed in at the main office at 7:55, and was given a packet of subplans by a secretary who was managing 3 simultaneous things, and handed him the materials with the specific efficiency of someone who needed him to be somewhere else now. And the plans indicated room 114, building C. And Phillip located building C without difficulty. It was the newer annex at the rear of the school grounds, connected to the main building by a covered walkway, and he walked the hallway of building C reading door numbers, Tran 110, 111, 112, 113, and then 115, with number 114 on any door. And he walked the hallway twice to confirm, and then returned to the main office and told the secretary that he couldn't locate room 114, and she looked at the subplans and then looked at her own scheduling sheet and said there was no room 114 in building C, and that the 5th grade class he had been assigned to was in room 1415, and Phillip said the plans said 114, and she said the plans were wrong, and he took this at face value and went to room 115, which was indeed a 5th grade classroom with 22 students in various states of pre-bell restlessness. And the day proceeded normally. But when he returned to the office at the end of the day to sign out, he passed building C on his way back through the covered walkway and looked down the hallway as he passed. And the door that had been between 113 and 115, she had checked twice that morning and found numbered 115, was numbered 114. And the door was standing open approximately 4 inches, and through the gap he could see the interior of a classroom, student desks, a chalkboard, natural light from a window on the far wall. Phillip stood at the hallway entrance for a moment, and then walked to the door and pushed it fully open and stood in the doorway. The room was a classroom, completely, accurately, functionally a classroom. Desks arranged in rows, a chalkboard with multiplication tables, written in the specific style of an elementary school teacher's careful hand. Construction paper student work pinned to the bulletin board along the left wall. A teacher's desk at the front with an attendance book open on its surface. And every detail of the room was correct except that the room had not been there at 7:55 a.m. and the student work on the bulletin board was dated. In the upper right corners of each paper, and the way all elementary school student work is dated, not with today's date, but with a date from 23 years ago. And the attendance book open on the teacher's desk showed a class list of 24 names in a column, each name followed by either a small check mark or a small circle, the standard notation of taken attendance, and at the bottom of the page in the teacher's handwriting, the date, the same date as the student papers, 23 years prior, and the note, 11 absent today. Illness spreading through the class, ported to office. Phillip stood in the room for what he estimates was approximately 4 minutes. Long enough to read the attendance book and the student papers, and to understand that what he was looking at was a room that was operating in, or had been preserved from, a time that was not the present. And then he stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door closed and walked to the main office and signed out. And when he returned the following week for a different placement at Dunmore Elementary, because the substitute system is automated and does not know what you have seen, he walked Building C's hallway before reporting to the office and the doors ran 110, 111, 112, 113, 115. No gap, number 114. The space between 113 and 115, occupied by solid wall, with no seam and no frame and no evidence that a door had ever been there. And Phillip has substituted at Dunmore Elementary 4 times since, and the door has not reappeared, and he has not reported what he saw to anyone at the school because the attendance book showed 11 absences. On a date 23 years ago for a spreading illness, and he looked up eventually. What illness had spread through schools in this district on that particular week, in that particular year? And what he found made him decide that room 114 was not his to report, but belonged to the 23 years it came from, and whatever remained of the children who had been absent from it. Marco Bryne had been a licensed general contractor for 18 years, operating his own small firm out of a county in the hill country of Central Oregon. And he had in those 18 years entered a very large number of structures in various states of disrepair, and had developed the specific professional ability to read a building quickly and accurately, to understand from a walk through its structural history, its successive modifications, the logic and the compromises of the people who had built and rebuilt it. And he was not a man who was easily surprised by what he found inside old buildings. Having encountered behind walls and under floors the accumulated evidence of decisions made by previous owners over many decades, outdated wiring, buried plumbing, structural modifications of varying competence, the occasional discovery that changed the scope and cost of the project significantly. The Hargrove property was an estate house in the hills built in 1908. It's 4 bedrooms, full basement, detached garage, purchased by a developer who intended to renovate it for resale and who had hired Marco's firm for the full interior gut and restoration. And Marco had walked the property twice before submitting his estimate and had a clear picture of the scope. Original plaster throughout, balloon frame construction. The basement that had been used for storage and needed drainage remediation, and a rear addition built in the 1960s that had been done competently but without. And none of this was unusual, and all of it was within his firm's competence. The discovery happened on the 3rd day, when his crew began opening the walls of the 2nd floor center bedroom to run new electrical. And the man doing the rough-in pulled a section of lath and plaster at the north wall and called Marco upstairs because what was behind. The wall was not the exterior sheathing that should have been there. The north wall of that room was an exterior wall on every plan and in every physical measurement Marco had taken, but another interior wall, finished in the same lath and plaster construction as all the other interior walls of the house, the coat of pale green paint that had dried and aged in a way consistent with application, in roughly the same period as the house's original construction, meaning that there was a wall behind the wall, and between them a space of approximately 2 feet in width, running the full length of the north face of the 2nd floor. Marco had them open the wall carefully because his instinct, which 18 years had made accurate, said that this required care and not speed. And what emerged as they pulled back the original plaster in sections was a corridor, 2 feet wide, running the full 40-foot length of the north face of the 2nd floor between the exterior sheathing and the false interior wall, with a plank floor laid directly on the ceiling joists of the 1st floor below, and a ceiling of rough board nailed to the underside of the roof structure above. The corridor had been finished not to a high standard, not to any standard that would be described as comfortable, but finished in the sense that deliberate effort had been applied to make it functional. The floor planks were nailed, Not loose, the walls were smooth, and along the corridor's right side, at intervals of approximately 6 feet, small apertures had been bored through the false interior wall at a height of 5 feet 6 inches, each aperture approximately 1 inch in diameter, and each one positioned to look directly into the second-floor bedroom through the false interior wall in the way that a person standing in the corridor could press their eye to the aperture and observe the room's interior in complete and unobstructed detail. At the corridor's north end, behind the bedroom's exterior window, a narrow vertical shaft dropped to the first floor through a gap in the joist structure, and the shaft was fitted with wooden rungs on one side in the manner of a very rudimentary ladder. Marco descended it and found himself in the basement, in a section of it that was sealed off from the main basement by a board partition that he had previously noted but cataloged as a utility separation. But nothing about it from the basement side suggested that it was an access to anything, and the sealed section of the basement was a room approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with a padlocked external door set into the foundation on the property's north face. A door that was not visible from the driveway or from any angle of the house's exterior he had walked, set below grade and behind a mature hedge that had grown over it in a way suggesting the door had not been used in a very long time. And inside the room, along one wall, a row of hooks bolted into the masonry. And below the hooks on the floor, in a line, the dark rectangular impressions of objects that had rested there long enough to stain the concrete in their exact shapes. And a small wooden table with a chair, and on the table an oil lamp without oil, and a composition notebook, and Marco opened the notebook, which contained entries in an unidentified hand covering approximately 60 pages. And the entries were undated but referenced seasons and temperatures and described, in careful and dispassionate language, a program of observation being conducted from the corridor above. And Marco closed the notebook and set it down, and climbed back up the shaft, and came out through the open wall of the second floor bedroom, and told his crew to stop work and called the county sheriff's office. And the subsequent investigation produced no identification of who had built the corridor, or when, or for how long it had been used. And the notebook was retained as evidence, and its contents were not disclosed to Marco in any official communication. And Marco completed the renovation after a 3-week delay, and has never since submitted a bid on a property built before 1930, without first spending a full day knocking on every interior wall with his knuckles, listening for the specific hollow register of a space where no space should be. Petra Ingram was 37 years old and worked as a technical writer for a manufacturing firm in Leeds, England. And she was a methodical and self-possessed person who organized her life with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had made peace early and without drama with who she was and what she required, a preference for order, a commitment to precision, a genuine comfort in routine that she had stopped apologizing for years ago. And when the first letter arrived, she understood immediately that something was wrong with it. Not in an atmospheric way, not in the way of a person prone to unease, but in the practical and specific way of a technical writer who processes language for a living and knows immediately when something is not what it is presenting itself as. The letter was addressed to her, handwritten in an envelope with her name and address on the front, delivered through the ordinary post on a Tuesday morning, and the handwriting on the envelope was hers, not similar to hers. Not reminiscent of hers, but hers, the specific formation of her letters, the angle of her pen, the particular way she connected certain character pairs that she had never seen replicated in another person's handwriting, which she recognized the way you recognize your own face, instantly and without doubt. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting on the paper was also hers, and the letter said, "Petra, don't sign the Alderton contract. I know you are planning to this week, and I know why, and the reasons are good reasons, but the outcome is not what you expect. Can't explain more than that right now. Please trust this." The Alderton contract was a freelance technical writing agreement she had been negotiating for 3 weeks and had not mentioned to anyone except her accountant. And she was indeed planning to sign it that week, and the reasons were good reasons: an attractive rate, a reputable company, a project timeline that suited her schedule, and she stared at the letter for a long time before placing it on her desk and continuing her morning as planned, because the alternative was accepting what the letter appeared to be saying about itself. And she was not prepared to do that, and she signed the Alderton contract on Thursday. The Alderton project collapsed 7 weeks later when the company entered administration, and the outstanding invoice she had submitted for the first phase of work was absorbed into the creditor queue and was never paid, which was a financial loss significant enough to affect 3 months of her stability and require uncomfortable conversations with her accountant about bridge financing. The second letter arrived the following month, same handwriting on the envelope, same handwriting inside. And it said, "I know you signed it anyway. I understand. Would have to." The next one is about your health. Not something dangerous, but something you are ignoring that you shouldn't be. Please make the appointment you have been putting off. This matters more than the contract did. Petra made the appointment she had been putting off, a routine gynecological screening she had been rescheduling for 8 months. And the screening identified a condition that was, as the letter had said, not dangerous in its current state, but which required intervention that was considerably simpler to manage at that stage than it would have been in another year or 2. She now has 6 letters, filed in order of arrival in a manila folder she keeps in her desk drawer. All in her handwriting, all addressed to her from herself. All describing future events with an accuracy that has increased rather than decreased as the correspondence has continued. And she has tried twice to write a return letter addressed to herself at her own address. Sent through the ordinary post, and both letters have been returned undeliverable, which is not something the post can explain because the address is valid and the letters she receives arrive without difficulty, and what Petra has arrived at. After a year of living with this correspondence is not a theory, because every theory she has constructed requires accepting a premise that her technical mind continues to reject. But a practice, she reads each letter carefully when it arrives, considers what it says against what she knows of her own life and intentions, and makes the adjustment it recommends. Because the letters have not once been wrong, and whatever she is writing to herself from wherever she is writing from. In whatever set of circumstances produced, the need to write appears to have very precise knowledge of what she needs to hear. And the care she takes with her language in each letter is the care of a person who knows that the recipient reads carefully and needs to believe what they are reading. And Petra is both of those people simultaneously, and she has decided that this is the most honest relationship she has ever been in. Noel Ashby was 44 years old and worked as a municipal GIS analyst for a regional council in the East Midlands of England, which is a job that involves the maintenance and updating of geographic information systems. The digital infrastructure of maps, land parcels, utility routes, and road networks that local government uses to plan and administer a geographic area. And Noel was thorough at this work, in the specific and unglamorous way of a person whose job is fundamentally about accuracy. About the correspondence between the data in the system and the actual physical world the system is supposed to represent. And he had been doing it for 13 years and had a professional's calibrated distrust of discrepancy, which meant that when his system showed something that did not match what should be there, his response was not curiosity, but methodology. Find the source of the error, correct it, document it. The discrepancy first appeared on a Tuesday during a routine audit of the road network dataset for the Calverstone district, which was an area of mixed residential and light industrial development on the council's western edge that Noel had maintained without issue for 9 years as stable. Mature area without significant development pressure, and therefore without frequent changes to the data set, and the discrepancy was this. The system showed a road that Noel did not recognize, named Cassier Lane, running approximately 400 meters from a junction with an existing residential street, into what the council's land use records showed as a protected greenbelt parcel. Road that did not appear in any version of the dataset Noel could access going back 7 years in the audit trail, and yet was present in the current live dataset with all the attributes of an established road, a road ID number, road classification, a surface type, a speed limit, maintenance, responsibility codes, even a last inspection date of 11 months prior, logged under the credential of a colleague who had left the council 4 years ago. Noel drove to the location on his lunch break, which was a reasonable drive from the office. And he parked at the junction where the system said Cassier Lane began and looked at the entry point. And there was a road there, a narrow residential road with tarmac surface and a white road marking at the junction. And he drove along it for approximately 350 meters until it ended in a turning circle at the edge of the greenbelt, with no houses along its length, no driveways. No signage, no indication of purpose, and on his return to the office, he ran every trace he could find in the council's records, planning applications, adoption records, highway agreements, utility connection records, and found no documentation of Cassier Lane's construction, adoption, or existence in any record predating the current live dataset. And the road ID number in the system was not sequential with the road IDs around it in the numbering scheme, which was the specific footprint of a manually inserted record rather than a system-generated one. He flagged the record to his supervisor, who drove out the following morning and confirmed the road was there and said they should find the adoption paperwork and sort out the audit trail. And Noel spent 3 weeks trying to find the adoption paperwork, which did not exist. And then he contacted the Ordnance Survey, which is the National Mapping Authority, and asked them to check their data set for Cassier Lane. And they reported that Cassier Lane did not appear in the national dataset. Not historically and not currently. It was a road that existed physically. It could be driven, that had road markings and a turning circle and a maintained tarmac surface. And that appeared in the council's GIS system with a full attribute record and a credentialed inspection history, and that did not exist in any official record of its creation. The greenbelt parcel that Cassier Lane ran into was verified as protected. Land with no planning permission for road construction ever granted or applied for. And the council's legal team confirmed that a road could not have been legally constructed on that land without a planning process that did not occur. 2 months after Noel first identified the discrepancy, he drove Cassier Lane again on a clear afternoon, this time walking the full length of it after he parked at the junction. And at the turning circle at the far end, he looked at the tree line where the road ended and the green belt began. And there was a gap in the trees, a narrow gap in the line of mature oaks that formed the green belt's edge. And through the gap there was another road, unpaved, narrow, continuing into the trees. Not appearing in his data set and not appearing on any map he had ever maintained, and Noel stood at the gap for a long time and did not go through it, because he was a man whose professional life was built on the careful reconciliation of data against reality. And what he understood standing at the end of Cassier Lane was that this gap in the trees was not a data error he could correct, and that some discrepancies are not there because someone made a mistake in the system, but because the system is showing you, with perfect accuracy, exactly what is there. And the question is not whether you can fix it, but whether you are prepared for what comes after you try. Delia Morrow was 34 years old and taught secondary school history in a small coastal town in Wales. And she had been close with her grandmother, Iris, in the specific way that skipped generation closeness sometimes forms. A bond that bypasses the complicated machinery of the parent-child relationship and arrives instead at the cleaner, more direct connection of two people who understand each other without the accumulated freight of a shared household and its frictions. And when Iris died at 81 in the spring, after a decline that had been gradual enough to prepare Delia intellectually without preventing the grief from being, when it arrived, total and specific, and entirely its own shape, Delia managed the estate work and the service arrangements and the distribution of her grandmother's belongings with the competent grief of a person who has no choice but to function and chooses to function as well as possible. And she kept two things from the house: a small ceramic dish Iris had kept on the kitchen windowsill for as long as Delia had memory, and her grandmother's phone, an old handset she had meant to set up for donation but had not gotten around to, which she brought home and set on her desk and then kept moving from surface to surface without purpose, because it was one of the last objects that retained her grandmother's habitual touch. She had not activated the phone or inserted a SIM card. It had been Iris's landline connection device. Not a mobile in the full sense, and it was powered off when she took it from the house. And it sat on her kitchen counter for 3 weeks before she picked it up to finally wrap it for donation, and found it warm in a way that objects left on counters do not become warm. The specific warmth of a device that has been running, and when she pressed the power button out of pure reflex, the screen came to life, showing a battery at 61% and one missed notification. A voicemail received for days after Iris's death from a number Delia did not recognize. She played the voicemail. The voice on it was her grandmother's, not a recording she had heard before, not a message she recognized. Not something she could explain as a cached file or a forwarded audio, but a fresh voicemail, in her grandmother's voice, at the quality of a voice that has passed its full strength, but still precisely itself. The message said, "Delia, it's Nan. I know this is strange, and I'm sorry for that. But I needed to tell you before too much time passed. The blue cardboard box in the attic, the square one behind the water tank. I need you to take it and read what's inside before anyone else does. And then I need you to decide what to do with it, and I trust you to make the right choice, because I always have. Don't rush. Just read it carefully. I love you." Delia drove to her grandmother's house, which was still in a state limbo before sale. What? And she climbed to the attic and found the blue cardboard box behind the water tank. a square box sealed with tape that had been applied recently. The tape was not aged, had not dried and cracked the way tape on a long-stored box aged, and inside the box was a collection of letters and documents spanning approximately 40 years of her grandmother's life that pertained to a period and a person and a set of decisions that Delia had never known about and that her grandmother had. It was clear from the documents, carried entirely alone. And the last document in the box was a handwritten note in Iris's writing, dated 2 weeks before her death, which said, "If you're reading this, you found it. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I tried many times. I hope the way I managed to tell you was not too frightening. There was no other way I could think of. Ma'am, Delia has not shared the contents of the box with her family. It's just the decision Iris trusted her to make. And the phone no longer powers on. It is truly off now. The battery discharged to 0, and Delia has kept it on her kitchen counter with no intention of donating it, because it is not. Whatever else it is, simply a phone and what she thinks about most. In the quiet of evenings, when she is not actively thinking about anything else, is not the impossibility of the voicemail, but the ordinary grief of a woman in her 80s who spent the last weeks of her life trying to find a way to finish one last conversation with the person she trusted most, and found one. Soren Vance was 39 years old and worked as a quality assurance engineer at a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in the industrial corridor outside of Frankfurt, Germany, and he had, in 11 years of Caul work, developed the professional disposition of a person whose entire function is the detection of variance, the systematic and documented identification of any point at which a process or a product deviates from its specified parameters, which meant that he was by both training and temperament. A person who noticed things, who maintained precise baselines and measured everything against them, and who found genuine professional satisfaction in the identification of an anomaly before it became a problem. Because in pharmaceutical manufacturing, an anomaly that is found before it becomes a problem is the entire point of the job. The facility ran a 24-hour operation across 3 shifts, and Soren had worked the mid-shift for 9 years, 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. With the accumulated familiarity of someone who knows a building the way they know a recurring route, and he was precise in his routines in the way that QA engineers tended to be precise, performing his rounds at specific intervals, logging his observations in the same sequence, using the same notations he had used for years, and there was comfort in this precision that he would not have described as comfort, but as competence, which is simply what comfort looks like in a person who measures things for a living. The anomaly he noticed first was minor and easily catalogued. His reflection in the polished stainless steel surface of the Batch 7 processing vessel, which he passed at the same point of his circuit every 2 hours, appeared to move a fraction of a second after he moved, not before, which would have suggested a camera or a display not simultaneously, which was the correct behavior of a reflective surface. But after, with a lag that he estimated at 1/4 of a second, and which was consistent enough across 6 separate observations over 3 shifts that he ruled out perceptual fatigue and logged it as a surface distortion anomaly, suspecting a change in the vessel's surface tension due to temperature differential, which was a documented phenomenon and a legitimate maintenance concern. When the maintenance team inspected the vessel's surface and found it within normal parameters and thermally stable, Soren recalibrated his measurement and returned to the vessel. At his next circuit, and stood before it, and moved his right hand deliberately, raised it slowly, held it still, lowered it, and watched the reflection perform the same sequence a quarter second behind him. And he stood very still after that for a long time. And the reflection stood still at the same moment without delay, which was not the behavior of a quarter-second lag, but the behavior of something that had finished moving when it was done moving, and was now simply watching him watch it. He began varying his route to approach the vessel from different angles and at different points in his circuit, removing the predictability of his approach. And the reflection was always already there when he arrived, always his own face, always his own clothes, always his own posture, but in the preceding position, as though it was showing him where he had just been rather than where he was. And in the fourth week, on a Tuesday, he approached the vessel from the east side rather than the west. The angle he never used because it required going around a secondary processing unit. And when he came around the secondary unit and the vessel's surface came into his line of sight, the reflection was looking the wrong direction, angled 15 degrees to the left of where Soren was standing, as though it was still expecting him from the west, and it stayed angled for a full 3 seconds before it shifted to face him. And the shift was slow, not the snap of a mirror adjusting to a new angle, but the deliberate turn of a face correcting its gaze. And Soren stood completely still and watched his reflection finish, turning to look at him. And then he said, "What are you?" in German, in a low and steady voice. And the reflection's mouth did not move, and the silence of the facility at 9 p.m. extended around him in all directions, and then not in his ears, not through any channel that produces sound in the way that sound is produced, but in the specific, interior place where a person hears the thought they did not originate. Where an idea arrives that was not generated by the mind that receives it, he understood the answer. And the answer was not what he would have expected, and not what he wanted, and it was not about the reflection at all. And Soren Vance filed a formal resignation from the facility 4 days later, citing personal reasons. Relocated his household to a different city, and has not given a detailed account of those 4 days to anyone. Except to say, when people ask why he left a stable career without a replacement position secured, I found the variance I was looking for, which is the truest answer he knows how to give. And that is all 10, a psychologist who discovered something in a child's imaginary companion that only she could know. A pharmacist filling a prescription for a patient already dead. Substitute teacher in a classroom operating 23 years out of time. A contractor who found a corridor behind a wall that a wall should not have had. A woman receiving letters in her own handwriting from somewhere she has not been yet. A GIS analyst whose maps showed a road the world had no record of building. A teacher who received one last voicemail from a grandmother already gone. An engineer who found the variance and could not unsee what it showed him. These are not ghost stories. These are not fictions dressed as facts. These are what happens at the edges, at the places where the ordinary world we have all agreed to live inside develops a seam, and the seam opens, and something on the other side steps through just far enough to be seen. We tell you these things at True Terror Files Official because these people are telling the truth, and the truth deserves to be told. Stay careful out there. And whatever you do tonight, whatever mirror you pass, whatever wall you knock on, whatever voicemail you almost don't listen to, pay attention. From True Terror Files Official, good night.